Speaking of which, as soon as the story broke last week, we knew we wanted to take a closer look at it. And that's probably because it's not a really great day for Intel and a lot of their workers. Because in an earnings call last week, the CPU giant revealed that while they did hit their target revenue guidance numbers after adjustment, there are some storm clouds on the horizon for everybody's favorite nerd factory. Challenges from AI companies, issues with some of their most recent chip developments, and a lot of cost cutting means that Pat Gelsinger is going back to the chopping block. Now, I will be the first person to admit I'm a Pat fan. So is Stephen Foskett and a lot of the other people here at the Rundown. However, they expressed to the industry that the way they're going to do this is by starting off and reducing 15% of their workforce. That's somewhere between 15 and 17,000 employees. They're going to suspend dividend payments through the end of this year through Q4. Analysts, including our own Daniel Newman, who did a great episode of 6.5 on this, said that Intel is definitely facing headwinds, but they have a lot of projects on the table that give them potential, provided they can deliver on them. This is a really big story. And I know, John, you guys said that you did an episode of Textron Gang specially focused on this. I'm going to let you open up. What are your thoughts on Intel and, well, quite frankly, some bad news?
It's not surprising. And like you and Steve, and I am a fan of Pat from his days at VMware in particular. He's a good man. He's one of the few normal, upstanding CEOs you can find. He also, I think, inherited a nearly impossible situation. He walked into a company that had missed out on mobile and AI. It had been moving slowly. Actually, it went from one of the great innovators of Silicon Valley to a great litigator to hold its market share. I'm going to put it this way, Tom. Years and years ago, when I was working at USA Today, we used to interview Steve Jobs a lot. And one of the questions I always wanted to ask him was, what are the companies that you most respect in the Valley or anywhere? He mentioned 4 companies. Intel was one of them. And now to see what they've gone through and what they have to achieve to get to the sun or the light skies is going to be quite difficult. Daniel was on the episode as well as the Textron Gang talking about Intel. And he said basically they have to be flawless. They have to be perfect. And one of the things they're going to have to do is is manufacturing these fab labs, especially in the United States, which is not easy to do, and it takes a long time. So that's part of the equation. The other equation is that they're always held up, not always, but often held up to NVIDIA and others, even AMD. And so he has to meet these expectations that are outsized. And once you lay off 15,000 people, and once you start making cuts to companies, it's really hard to stop making cuts. And I think, I fear that they fall into the same trap that HP had done for years, where they just kept cutting and cutting to meet their numbers in terms of profitability, and even to a lesser extent, Cisco. I think of this as a great American tragedy in a sense. Perhaps he pulls it off, but it's been rocky the last couple of years. I'll have to be honest.
You're not wrong. This is not the first time we've had this conversation. And I think that maybe the bright spot here is that this is not the start of Pat's cuts. This is a continuation of him realizing that Intel is not where it needs to be right now. And look, Intel 3 years ago was not in a good place. Intel today is in a better place. You may not believe it. Like the poor sod that invested $700,000 in Intel stock on Wall Street bets is probably kicking himself right now, but he shouldn't kick himself, because you know what? There's nowhere to go but up from here. I'll tell you why. And I agree with Daniel completely. Intel has to deliver. That is not even on the table anymore. That is a absolute maxim. Gaudi has to come out, even if it's not going to upset the apple cart, because you have to have a success to build on success. If Gaudi fails, then whatever's coming next is not going to work, because nobody will listen to them. They have to compete and be ready to get down in the trenches against AMD, not NVIDIA. Hold that thought. They have to compete against AMD because their bread and butter is CPUs. You know, Intel is not a software company. Intel is not a services company. Intel is not a company that manufactures anything other than chips. And if you are being beat up by your closest competitor, you are going to lose no matter what else you do if you can't do the thing that you were built to do right. So if they're ever going to compete against NVIDIA, they have to defend themselves against AMD because NVIDIA is eating everybody's lunch right now. You've got to defend your house. More importantly, as Daniel said, you've got to build more houses. Now, this is where I think some of the analysis is a little bit off. Intel got a lot of money from the CHIPS Act, and Intel is going to invest that money in building fabs. That's good. Intel is going to increase fab capacity and possibly even farm out some of their fab operations to other people. That's good. What's bad is Wall Street punishing Intel for not building a fab in a month. You can't do that. We know that. We're not playing on a quarterly timeline with Intel right now. We're playing on a yearly timeline if we're lucky. It could even be a decade before all the fab operations are up and running. And there's a lot of stuff that can happen in a decade because 10 years ago, Intel was unstoppable. We all knew that. But what's going to happen is that Pat's going to get judged every 3 months on something that is completely out of his control. Even if he could assemble the Constructicons and every available worker on the planet to build these fabs, they're not going to get built in the amount of time that Wall Street wants them to be built on. And when you look at the fact that they're going out and they're lowering their guidance and saying, you know, we're going to miss, when they have legitimate issues with their latest 13 and 14 gen CPUs that honestly they don't think they're going to be able to fix. Things like that happen when you're working at the scales that these things are. And I'm not excusing it. Hey, Intel, do better about building chips. The problem is that when you have these massive x86 CISC processors and something goes wrong in them, that material impacts as opposed to something like an ARM chip where it's like, oh, great, there's a problem with the yields on the M4s. Well, you know, we'll just make a whole bunch more of them and correct that yield. It's not complicated enough. When you look at the shift away from using Intel, that says that Intel's either too big to really integrate into what's going on, or they need to innovate in those areas. And that's where I think that they have a chance to really succeed. But Wall Street's got to give them a little time to turn this ship. I've talked about it before in a lot of companies like Cisco. You know, Cisco is maybe not as big as Intel, but they have the same agility issues that Intel does, which is that aircraft carrier doesn't turn on a dime. So shifting a company like Cisco from a hardware box pusher to a software services company is succeeding slowly. Intel shifting away from all of the myriad of things that they were doing, moving back down to a company that makes chips and farms out fabrication facilities and then uses those chips to move into markets like AI and other things, is not something that's going to happen overnight.
Unfortunately, Wall Street doesn't think rationally. So I believe and I fear for Intel shareholders at least is that every 90 days with this 90-day shot clock, they're going to get punished. So the expectations, they're going to fall short of them. And once a company is wounded, they become catnip to a lot of people. The investor community, activist investors, they'll put more and more pressure on him. And I think once you fall behind, especially in the valley, there's this perception that once you're wounded and once you're yesterday's company, that it's really difficult to escape that. And I think of, and it's maybe it's a poor comparison, but I think of what Marissa Mayer went through with Yahoo. She went into this once strong company that was clearly in decline. There's really nothing much she could do. And I fear that Pat is in the same situation. And I think he's going to be the victim of it eventually. And I don't see a happy ending for him.
Yeah. Well, Pat, we're all thinking about you. We have faith in you. Make this happen because I want to keep covering positive stories about you. That's what we do.